In 1920, much of the world was still in turmoil following the ending of the First World War. The Bolsheviks were fighting on all fronts to achieve power in Russia. Among their enemies was the newly independent Republic of Poland. Some semblance of normality seemed to be returning further west. Britain's royal family gathered to see Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, off on a visit to the United States. Everywhere he was greeted by enthusiastic crowds. And among his engagements was a review of cadets at West Point, America's military academy. Troops were also out in Boston for a different purpose, escorting two men to trial for a crime many people felt they were being framed for. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were accused of robbery and murder, but it was widely felt that they were being made scapegoats for the unrest which was sweeping the United States. Rapid industrialization during the last quarter of the 19th century and first part of the 20th had seen an explosive growth in America's great cities. Millions of immigrants had been drawn in from Europe, seeking a new life away from the squalor and oppression of many of the regimes there. But for many of these new Americans, conditions in the New World were to turn out little better materially than those they had left. Wages and working conditions were still miserable, and the slums of the new cities just as bleak. Both before and after the First World War, labor unrest was widespread. Trade unions led massive strikes and demonstrations to demand better conditions. And these turned increasingly to violence. This violence was not confined to the streets. In June 1919, the home of United States Attorney General Mitchell Palmer was bombed. He vowed to crush what he called the Red Movement, the communists, anarchists, and even traditional unions which were seen as a single international subversive movement threatening the whole fabric of American society. Troops were deployed in many cities to prevent any further gatherings or demonstrations. For many people, this seemed to confirm that widespread chaos might erupt at any time. On the 2nd of January 1920, Palmer's Justice Department raided immigrants' homes, arresting some 1,000 people and confining them without trial in makeshift camps. Most were soon released when it was ruled that their constitutional rights had been abused. But there was initially little concern when two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, were taken into custody on the 5th of May 1920, having been found carrying anarchist literature. For their home city of Boston had seen some of the most violent unrest and brutal police action. The crimes of which they were soon accused had occurred about 20 miles south of Boston, some 3 weeks before, on the 15th of April, in the little town of South Braintree. Two American Express security guards met the morning train from Boston and signed for an iron box from the guard's van. They took the box from the railway station to their office in nearby Hampton House. It contained some $27,000, the week's wages for two of the largest companies in the town. As they arrived, one of the guards noticed a shiny, dark-colored car parked across the street. There was also a thin, fair-haired man watching from a doorway. A little later, Frederick Parmenter, the accountant from one of the two companies, Slater and Morrill, arrived with security guard Alexander Berardelli. to take their share, which had been put in 2 cash boxes, to the factory a few hundred yards away. As this later reconstruction shows, the American Express guards watched them set off just before 3 p.m. down Railroad Avenue. As they turned into Pearl Street and walked up it, across the level crossing, the 2 men stopped to talk briefly to Jimmy Bostock, the company's repairman. They were then seen by workers on a building site crossing the road in front of the Rice and Hutchings factory, the other major company in the town. There, 2 short, stocky men were hanging about on the pavement. As Parmenter and Berardelli crossed towards them, they pulled pistols out of their pockets. Berardelli was shot and collapsed. Parmenter turned, but was hit twice in the back. A dark-colored touring car now appeared, and the 2 men grabbed the cash boxes and jumped in, watched by several witnesses, including Jimmy Bostock. There was another man on the running board who jumped off, firing at onlookers, and again at Berardelli. All the men now piled into the car, which headed off westwards. The car was stopped by the level crossing barrier, but the crossing keeper was forced at gunpoint to raise it. He was one of many witnesses who referred to a fair-haired driver and 2 swarthy men. No one mentioned that any of them had a moustache. A little while later, a dark touring car was seen driving fast on the road going south towards Brockton and West Bridgewater. Berardelli died in the street before he could be moved, and Parmenter shortly afterwards in hospital. The bullets were removed from their bodies at post-mortems, and the ones which appeared to be fatal were carefully marked. A hold-up had occurred on the previous Christmas Eve at West Bridgewater, about 20 miles south of Braintree. This had also involved a dark-colored getaway car. The local police chief suspected Italian immigrants who had settled in the area of being involved, and wondered if the 2 incidents were connected. His suspicions grew when a car was found abandoned on the 17th of April in woods near West Bridgewater. This was quickly identified as the one used during the killings at South Braintree. Searches of the local area were now begun, and on the 20th of May, 2 men were stopped on a tram at Campello. They were Sacco and Vanzetti. They gave confused explanations as to who they'd been visiting, and when searched, were found to have guns concealed on them, a loaded .38 pistol and a .32 Colt automatic, as well as the anarchist literature. Nicola Sacco, who was clean-shaven and usually wore a trilby, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who had a large moustache, claimed that they were carrying the guns for self-defense, and that they had no anarchist or communist connections. But the fact that they had been found carrying subversive literature was enough for them to be detained for the night. For anarchism, with its hatred of capitalism and established authority, had long been a particular concern in the United States. It had burst on the national scene in 1901 at an exhibition in Buffalo, when President William McKinley was assassinated by a deranged Polish immigrant and self-proclaimed anarchist, Leon Czolgosz. As a political creed, anarchism had begun in Europe and flourished particularly in Russia and Eastern Europe as a focus of resistance to the absolutist regime of the Tsars. Anarchists had been responsible for many bombings and assassination attempts. Anarchism and communism had been carried to the United States with the great waves of immigration from Eastern Europe and Russia, which had flooded through Ellis Island in the 1890s. The movement played a major role in the fight for better working conditions in the years before the First World War. Along with communism, anarchism acquired an even more sinister face after the war, with the overthrow of the Tsar and the seizure of power in Russia by Lenin and his Bolsheviks. At first, the authorities said nothing to Sacco or Vanzetti about the South Braintree murders, but the next day, both men claimed to have been at work on the 15th of April. It emerged that Nicola Sacco was a shoemaker. He had been born in southern Italy on the 22nd of April, 1891. He had come to the United States in April 1908 and at first found work in a road gang. He studied shoemaking, got a good job, and soon gained a reputation as a conscientious and skilled craftsman who earned a good wage. Sacco got married in 1912 to an Italian girl, Rosina, and they had a son named Dante. Sacco was a devoted family man, but he became increasingly involved in workers' causes, distributing anarchist literature and helping raise money for strikers. Bartolomeo Vanzetti was also born in Italy on the 11th of May, 1888. He trained as a pastry chef and baker, but when he came to the United States in June 1908, he gave this up and took to laboring. He too was increasingly involved in anarchist activities, acting as a strike coordinator at a factory in Plymouth. But he ended up opposing both the traditional unions and the management. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, both men, like many other immigrants, fled across the border to Mexico to avoid conscription. They returned at the end of the war, but this action only served to increase popular suspicion of immigrants. Sacco went back to his job at the shoe factory, while Vanzetti began selling fish from a handcart in the Boston markets. He became a well-known street character, forever arguing politics. The men's decision to lie about their anarchist connections told against them. When it was discovered that neither had a proper permit for the guns, the police began to feel certain that they had been involved in the South Braintree murders. However, none of the witnesses to whom they were shown could positively identify them, although several picked out Vanzetti as having been involved in the Bridgewater holdup on Christmas Eve. Sacco had a cast-iron alibi, and Vanzetti produced 16 different witnesses from the Italian community in Boston to say that they had bought fish from him that day. Nevertheless, 5 witnesses on the Bridgewater wages case remained adamant that they had seen him. So on the 11th of June, Vanzetti was charged with assault and attempted robbery. When the case came to court, much was made of the fact that Vanzetti's alibi was provided by fellow Italians, many of them family friends. The jury chose to believe that there had been collusion, and on the 16th of August, Vanzetti was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. Then, on the 11th of September, Sacco and Vanzetti were charged with murder and robbery at South Braintree. There was an immediate outcry, particularly within the Italian community, and a Sacco Vanzetti Defense Committee was formed. Protest demonstrations were broken up. There was concern when it was learned that District Attorney Katzman, who was in charge of the case, had dismissed the police officer leading the investigation. It emerged later that Captain Proctor had been concerned that most of the evidence seemed to point away from the 2 anarchists. The case did not come to trial until the 31st of May 1921 in the Superior Court building in Dedham, Massachusetts. Armed police surrounded the court, and all those entering were searched for guns. large crowds watched the two men arrive. Sacco was defended by an abrasive, radical lawyer from California, Fred Moore. He soon clashed with the judge, 63-year-old Justice Webster Thayer, over the selection of the jury. Moore was determined to exclude anyone even remotely middle class or educated. He also fell out with Vanzetti's lawyer, who was convinced that an educated jury would be better able to understand the flimsiness of the case against the two men. Jury selection took over 4 weeks, and in the end it consisted mainly of shopkeepers and factory workers. When Attorney General Katzman opened the case, he tried to produce eyewitnesses who would link the two men to the shooting. But under cross-examination, 26 admitted that they could not. 7 thought that they might have seen Sacco, and 2 put Vanzetti in the getaway car, although neither had mentioned his moustache before. Katzman then turned to the guns, which had obviously been acquired and carried illegally. He made little attempt to prove forensically that either of them had fired the fatal bullets, although Captain Proctor did admit that one of the bullets might have come from a Colt, although not necessarily the one in question. Katzman dwelt heavily throughout on the anarchist threat and the fact that both men were known to be supporters. He tried hard to get them to admit that they were determined to overthrow the government of their adopted country. He made much of the fact that both had fled to Mexico rather than fight for it. Both men denied that they would ever have used violence to further their beliefs. Sacco made an impassioned speech arguing that his flight to Mexico had shown that he was a dedicated pacifist who would never use violence. In his summing up for the jury, Judge Thayer said little about the thinness of the prosecution case. He too chose to emphasize the threat of godless anarchism to American society. In the end, it was these fears which swayed the jury, rather than the fact that there was no conclusive evidence to link either man to the South Braintree killings. After 5 hours' deliberation, on the 14th of July, they found both men guilty of murder. Judge Thayer decided that he would pass sentence at a later date, once defense appeals for a retrial had been heard. As the two men were led away, Sacco cried out, "They killed 2 innocent men." The two men were taken under heavy guard to Charlestown Prison, where they were to remain for more than 5 years. The verdict brought immediate and massive protests, which reflected widespread disquiet at the lack of solid evidence. The protests were not confined to the United States, and massive demonstrations took place in other countries, including France and Italy. Hopes of changing the authorities' minds were kept alive by reports that even the few original witnesses who had seemed certain were now becoming more hesitant. In the United States, a series of legal teams funded by the unions and popular donations kept up the fight. Over the next 5 years, 6 separate motions were lodged for a retrial, but each one was rejected by Justice Thayer. More significantly, in 1925, a convicted murderer in Dedham jail confessed that he had been one of the killers. Celestino Medeiros refused to name his accomplices, but was known to belong to the Boston Morelli gang. Members of the gang had been seen near Braintree before the shootings. Medeiros' testimony was rejected by the Massachusetts authorities. They seemed determined to stand by the jury's decision regardless of any new evidence. Sacco's wife visited him in prison and also spent time with Vanzetti, who had no family to support him. Sacco refused to allow his daughter Ines, who had been born after his arrest, to come, but he corresponded lovingly with her once she was old enough to understand his letters. On the 17th of February 1923, Sacco went on a 31-day hunger strike. He was taken for treatment to the Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane. Vanzetti did have a real nervous breakdown and was taken to the same hospital on the 2nd of January 1925. On his return to prison, he wrote, "Our execution is already a fact." On the 5th of April 1927, the Massachusetts Supreme Court dismissed the final appeal for a retrial, and the way was clear at last for Justice Thayer to pass sentence. 4 days later, he sentenced Sacco and Vanzetti to die in the electric chair. There was another massive outcry, and the US government came under diplomatic pressure from dozens of countries to intervene, but the authorities insisted that it was a matter for the state alone. Appeals for mercy were received from prominent international figures such as Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, but none had any effect. On the 4th of May, Vanzetti made a final appeal to Massachusetts Governor Alvin Fuller. Fuller set up a committee to review all the evidence, but on the 3rd of August, he announced that there would be no retrial. The executions would go ahead in 1 week. Then, on the 10th of August, 30 minutes before they were due to go to the chair, Sacco and Vanzetti were granted a 12-day stay of execution so that their attorney could produce new evidence. But this could not save them. At midnight, on Thursday the 22nd of August, both men were executed. Some 500 armed policemen had taken up position during the afternoon to seal off Charlestown prison from a huge crowd. That same night, in the same prison, Celestino Medeiros, whose confession had seemed to exonerate the two men, was executed as well. The next morning, the bodies were taken from the prison. Huge crowds demonstrated in Union Square in New York, and there were protests and vigils in other cities throughout the United States to mourn the deaths. Some of the protests turned violent as the homes of jurors and the judge were attacked. As the two men were given a lavish funeral, attempts to clear their name posthumously continued. Then, in 1973, a mafia defector, Vincent Teresa, revealed that on his deathbed, Boston gang boss Frank Morelli had admitted that his men had carried out the South Braintree robbery and killings. He is alleged to have said, "We whacked them out. We killed those guys in the robbery. Those two greaseballs took it on the chin." On the 19th of July 1977, Sacco's grandson, Spencer Sacco, received a proclamation from Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. This declared that any stigma and disgrace should be forever removed from the names of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti.